Well, thank you very, very much to the Secretary of State and to Anne Freeman for giving up their time during what I know is probably one of the busiest times that Defra has seen for so long. I'm very, very pleased to welcome these two speakers today to this very special briefing event. Representatives from the devolved fisheries authorities were also asked to speak, but were unfortunately unable to attend. Thank you to all those who have submitted questions in advance. I have questions here and I will be putting them forward to the speakers at the appropriate times. Just a note that there will not be an opportunity to ask further questions during the event. We've had a lot of questions submitted and the Secretariat has edited and combined some for time and clarity. But if you feel your question has not been covered adequately during this event, do get in touch with the Secretariat. This event is being recorded and will be available online next week, and there will be further post-event materials released too. And I'd just like to hand over now to Jacob for some housekeeping before we go over to the Secretary of State. Over to you, Jacob.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Yes, not much to add from me, but just to say thank you very much for everyone who's listening in and for everyone who sent in questions as well. We've been absolutely thrilled to see the level of engagement for this event. Yeah, so just to clarify, the event will be recorded and we'll publish it on the APPG website, probably early next week. And if you'd like any updates on the group's future activities, do sign up to our newsletter too. Our website is fisheriesappg.org. And you can also get in contact with us directly at secretariat@fisheriesappg.org. But that's all for me. I'll hand straight back over.
Right, thank you very much. Secretary of State, a very warm welcome to a fellow Cornishman. And I'm now going to hand over to you to give us a little brief presentation on where we are, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl. Can I just start by, thanking you for all of the work that you've done in this area. Your expertise, lifetime's expertise on fishing, is regularly brought to bear on Parliament, regularly features in difficult questions for Defra ministers since you were elected. And I'm really pleased that the APPG has brought this particular event together. I know that the focus of the event is intended to be the Fisheries Act and the powers in that, what we intend to do with those. I'll say a little bit about that, but I'm also conscious that at the moment there are kind of wider issues that are also a relevance at the moment, which I'll touch on. But the Fisheries Act really is the first. It gives us all the powers that we need to take back control of our waters, to be an independent coastal state for the first time in almost half a century. At the heart of it, it sets out a series of fisheries objectives, principally around sustainability, but also around socioeconomic factors for fishing communities as well. It commits all of the devolved administrations, every part of the UK, to work together on a joint fisheries statement that will set out how collectively, as the United Kingdom, we will deliver on those objectives. And behind that as well, there will be some management plans that show for each stock how we intend to move it towards MSY and how we intend to move towards more sustainable fishing. So there's a set of key objectives at the start of the bill and a series of plans that are required to show how we will deliver those. We then have some very important powers in the bill to be able to license foreign vessels that seek access to our exclusive economic zone, and also the ability to put license conditions on those vessels, and of course the power as well to set technical conservation measures. And while obviously elements of fisheries policy for the next 5 years at least were settled through the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, there is still a huge area around technical conservation, and that remains very much something that the UK will do on its own, in its own waters. And we're doing quite a lot of thinking at the moment on technical conservation measures and what can be achieved in that particular front to protect our marine environment. I will say a bit about the trade and cooperation agreement concluded shortly before Christmas. I think, look, it's fair to say that we did not get all of the things that we wanted. We hoped, I think we always recognized that there would be a multi-annual agreement of perhaps 3 to 5 years. We made no secret of the fact that we'd hoped in that time to be able to move closer to a sharing arrangement that was closer to zonal attachment. You know, in the end, compromises had to be made to get an overall agreement. So while it doesn't get everything that the fishing industry wanted, there are some important steps in the right direction. So we have, as the price of continued access to UK waters, the EU have effectively had to forfeit close to 25% of the fish that they were previously catching in our waters in a new sharing and access agreement. That'll be obviously reviewed after 5.5 years, but after 5.5 years, it's open to us to change the access arrangements in the 6 to 12, or indeed anywhere else in our exclusive economic zone. There would be a provision at that point for the European Union to consider retaliatory measures with tariffs on fish exports if it wanted to. So they would retain some negotiating leverage at that point. But I think the important thing to recognise is that while this hasn't been everything that the fishing industry would have wanted, it is an important step in the right direction. And the final thing, just to acknowledge, is there have been some teething problems in these, in the initial month with some of the export documentation caused by challenges on both sides. It is quite a complex process. And so in those first few weeks, there were instances of businesses or even certifying officers perhaps not quite getting the paperwork right. Sometimes import agents on the EU side not correctly pre-notifying the goods that were coming, getting addresses wrong and so forth, that caused some problems. And there have been issues as well with border staff, both in France and the Netherlands, who have also been on a steep learning curve and have been trying to get to grips with these new processes. Sometimes they themselves have made errors, and we've had to work closely with them in a dialogue so that they can understand when something they're requesting is actually not correct and not what's required under the official control regime. Things are improving from that difficult start in January. There are now around 50 lorries a day that are making that journey, and given that the export market's quite subdued anyway due to the coronavirus lockdown, that's quite close to what we would expect to be normal levels. We now know that around just over half, 55% of those lorries are actually clearing the border control post within an hour, typically about 45 minutes at the French side. Some are taking a bit longer, but well over 90% now are getting through within 3 hours. So it's an improving situation, and I think it will get faster and faster as people get more and more used to the procedures and understand more about what is required. And that's probably enough from me, Cheryl, by way as a scene setter, because I'm sure people will have questions and probably keen to get into those.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. And if I could just say beforehand, I'd like to offer my thanks to the Fishmongers Company who sponsor our Secretariat of the APPG, without whom we wouldn't be able to have events like this. And also make you aware that we do have some of my colleagues on the call today. We've got Peter Aldous, we've got Alan Campbell MP, Selene Saxby MP, Robert Goodwill MP, Alistair Carmichael MP, Sherilyn McCrory MP, Leon Nietzsche MP, Faye Jones MP, Trudy Harrison MP, and Charles Courtney, the Earl of Devon. So from all around the coast, you do have colleagues listening in. We have this, as I said, the Secretariat have put together some questions and we've amalgamated them because they were similar. So the first question I've got for you comes from Jerry Percy, Nick Howell and Andy Giles, and they ask, the inshore fleet has expressed disappointment at the failure to secure exclusive access to the 6 and 12 mile limit. Given that future amendments to the agreement after the adjustment period are likely to result in social and economic penalties to the UK, will there be the possibility of excluding EU vessels from the 6 to 12 mile limit without significant repercussions for the United Kingdom?
Well, yes, so it says it's a 5.5-year agreement. And look, I do understand the disappointment, since we have been saying consistently that we felt the 6 to 12 mile zone should be predominantly for UK fishermen. And certainly our approach was that we were trying to make sure that was exclusive access, because it is important that for our own inshore fishermen that we reduce some of that fishing competition from foreign vessels in that 6 to 12 mile zone. The short answer is yes, we will be able to change that once that 5.5 years is up. There would be the ability for the EU, if they wanted, to put some tariffs on some of our fish exports. However, it's always been our contention that on fish exports, the impact of the tariffs is actually more modest than on some other sectors like agriculture. And so on shellfish, our main export, it's around 8%. On things like salmon, it's 2 or 3%. And so the ability to severely disrupt that trade, any more than they already have done, to be honest, with things like the stance taken on bivalve mollusks, is actually relatively limited. So I don't think that there'll be anything to prevent us from taking that further step at that point, since it's always been our contention that if the choice were between controlling our waters and having to pay a few tariffs on some fish exports, we would probably act to have that control of our waters. And given that we are seeing some difficulties on exports anyway, I think that would make that case even stronger. The final thing to say on this is that although we've granted those EU vessels in that 6 to 12 mile zone, obviously, as I said, there are things that we are looking at by way of technical conservation measures. So it is the case that vessels seeking access to the 6 to 12 zone and indeed to our exclusive economic zone will have to abide by those particular measures.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. The next question I've got for you comes from David Lyle, who is a board member of the Marine Management Organisation. And he asks, how might we maximise the opportunities for international partnership working opened up by the Fisheries Act and Brexit? And to what extent will we be able to work internationally with the EU to ensure a common worldwide approach to sustainable fishing?
Well, look, leaving the EU gives us the ability to rejoin and speak our own mind in our own way on a whole range of regional fisheries management organisations around the world. So as an EU member, we have this rather extraordinary position that the European Union represented the UK in annual negotiations with the Faroes, even though the UK is the only country really that had any particular interest in that bilateral agreement. And extraordinary that the EU represented us in negotiations with Norway. Now that's changed. We now will represent ourselves in those negotiations with important neighbours like Norway and like Faroes. We will also rejoin the, we're members of ICAT, but ironically, only so that we can represent overseas territories like Bermuda prior to leaving the EU. We will now represent ourselves as an independent coastal state on those other regional fisheries management organisations. And we've already rejoined NIAFC, which deals with the Northeast Atlantic, and NAFO as well, which deals with some of the North Atlantic shared stocks. So yes, the UK will continue to work constructively, obviously with the EU, but also with other like-minded countries around the world.
Thank you very much. Now, Jerry Percy, the chair of the new Under 10 Metre Association, asks, can the under 10 metre sector be assured that any new fishing quota as a result of Brexit is not simply allocated to larger vessels, as it was within the FQA system, that's fixed quota allocation system, but is rather used to support the under 10 metre fleet?
Yes, we've always said that any new quota over and above what used to come through relative stability, we intend to allocate in a different way. Now, in this first year, it is complicated to a certain extent because of the uncertainty that we currently have over the international exchanges, the annual exchanges that we seek to do with the EU, where what we need to do is to unravel the PO to PO swaps that used to take place and effectively offer those species that tend to be underfished or have traditionally been offered in exchange for something else to secure the quota that we've in the recent history fished against. So we're having to take that into account as well. And we're clear that in the way we allocate quota this year, we want to make sure that people have access to the quota that they've normally fished rather than the quota that they might have exchanged for something else. So we're trying to work through a fair methodology on that. But yes, beyond that, it was clear in our white paper that we also intend to make additional quota available to the inshore pool. And also, in addition to that, we've just concluded a consultation on the economic link, and we are proposing that we will increase the percentage of catch that vessels need to land in the UK, including foreign-owned vessels who bought UK flagged vessels. They will need to, in future, land at least 70% of their quota, or they will effectively have to forfeit quota in that year to be redistributed to other sectors, which might well include the inshore fleet. So we've toughened the economic link conditions with a view to releasing quota from some of those foreign vessels that land abroad so that that can be redistributed fairly in the UK.
I'm sure that will be very welcome news, Secretary of State. Now, we heard from a skipper, Andy Giles, in the first question, who is actually my constituent. We're now going to go to Skipper John Clark from Peterhead. So we're going to nip up to the other end of the United Kingdom. And he asks, given that it was repeatedly stated that fishing access would not be linked to the wider trade deal, why did the UK government sacrifice this red line, leading to widespread disappointment among fishing communities?
Well, we maintained all along that we thought they were two separate issues, and it was our stance consistent right through the negotiation that we wanted a fisheries partnership agreement, and that our starting point was that we wanted there to be annual negotiations. I think we always recognised, and in fact, when I talked to the industry, people understood that you wouldn't get to zonal attachment in one bound, that this would be something that we would do over several years. It's true that both the industry and us ideally would not have had our hands tied, that we would have incrementally acted in a reasonable way to the EU, but each year managed to get some progress towards a fairer, more scientific sharing arrangement. But I think the truth is that in the end, the Prime Minister and the government had to take a particular judgment here, which is, do we actually walk away and have no agreement at all with all that entails, including tariffs, including no agreements on all sorts of other areas? Do we do that, or do we actually try to reach a compromise and get a settlement? I mean, I would point out that in the final weeks, in fact, fisheries arguments dominated. You will recall that a deal looked like it was in sight, and then negotiations carried on for another full week. And I can reveal that's because the Prime Minister, recognised that we needed to have another go and try and move the dial on this. And we did make some further progress on some of our asks. And it won't have escaped your notice that, effectively the equivalent of a December council with arguments through the night on individual fish stocks meant that journalists and everybody else was kept waiting for another full 24 hours while we argued about, the difference in value between ling and saithe in the North Sea, for instance. So it wasn't for the lack of fighting or trying on the part of the Prime Minister's part. We made, I think in the end, we had to look at things in the round and reach an overall settlement. There's a significant uplift in quota, as I said, not as much as we'd hoped, not as much as we aimed for. We didn't get everything that we wanted for fishing in the negotiation. We fought very hard to the bitter end, but in the end, we did have to make an overall judgment about whether we wanted there to be some kind of trading agreement. And I think in the final analysis, not to have any kind of free trade agreement with our nearest and largest trading partner, really in the cold light of the day, doesn't make sense. So we chose in the end to get that agreement for the wider benefits that it brought.
Thank you very much for your honesty there, Secretary of State. And I just want to welcome Martin Vickers as well, who is the MP for Cleethorpes and has joined the call. We've now got a question from Simon MacDonald, who's the chairman of the West Coast Regional Inshore Fisheries Group, Scotland. And he asks, will the government work with the EU to streamline the shipping of live shellfish so that it can reach the market within 1 or 2 days, as it has done in the past?
Yes, look, we were ready to have this discussion with the EU during the negotiations, in that I think it's eminently possible to recognise equivalence of our standards, similar approaches. There is no public health or animal health risk from shellfish leaving the UK, going to the European Union. I'm afraid the difficulty is that the European Union have a very political stance on these things, which is if you want any leeway on anything, then you have to abide by EU law and accept the jurisdiction of the European Court and dynamically align your regulations and do whatever we tell you to do. And that clearly, can't be acceptable for an independent sovereign nation like the UK, which is, one of Europe's largest economies. So, it wasn't possible. I think it would have been a mistake to agree to dynamic alignment. And that is why, having chosen not to stay in the single market or in the EEA, we are left at the moment with this paperwork. I think there could be a window that opens when it's possible to have a discussion about a veterinary partnership agreement. The EU do have a veterinary partnership agreement, for instance, with New Zealand. So it's quite possible to do this and to recognise that we have similar equivalent standards. And it may be that that can happen once we start, requiring the same paperwork, since of course we've inherited EU law through retained EU law. So when we start to require export health certificates for goods travelling the other direction, that will be, equally inconvenient for some of those EU exporters. And it's quite possible that at that time we can come together and say, we recognise that there's paperwork and that there will be a need to give one another assurance and reassurance about the safety of food, but we can all agree that we can do this in a more efficient way. And it's certainly the case that fishing businesses I talk to who export around the world, make the point that other developed countries in the world have better, more refined systems for dealing with these things than the European Union. The EU's forms and paper forms requiring things to be manually crossed out in ink and so on are really quite outdated and quite backward. And in this digital age, it ought to be possible to capture the same information in a much more efficient way.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. I know you have to leave us at 2:30, but if we could just squeeze in one more question, please. It's from somebody I've known for a very long time during my time being involved in fisheries in various roles. It's from Mike Park, OBE, the Chief Executive of the Scottish White Fish Producers Association. And he asks, as laid out in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, it seems that as long as the total allowable catch is set for a stock, then access to that area for EU vessels will follow, even after the adjustment period ends in mid-2026. With this in mind, how can the UK increase its quota share besides through international swaps?
Well, international swaps is obviously what we will use in the interim, but my understanding is that in that first 5.5-year period, there is a default mechanism which says that in the absence of an agreement on tax between the parties, then the IC's advice is followed and becomes the basis for allocation. But I don't think that is the case after the 5.5 years. And after the 5.5 years, there'd be nothing to stop us changing the access. And therefore, once you change your access requirements, the dynamic of a fisheries negotiation, as Mike knows, having seen many in his time, is that access is what flushes out who's actually got the fish in their waters. And that is the point at which those who seek access to another's waters because they don't have fish in their own waters become the demandeur, as it were, and actually have to accept certain concessions.
Secretary of State, I know you've got to leave us, but can I just say again, thank you so much for giving up your time, because I know that with your brief, as large as it is, you and the Fisheries Minister, Victoria, are working flat out well into the night, starting in the early hours of the morning, almost 7 days a week, because I know we've had briefings at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. So can I say a huge thank you for doing us the honour of answering our questions today. And I hope that it won't be the first time that you engage with the APPG. We'd love to welcome you back at some other time. But thank you so much. And also thank you for allowing Anne Freeman to stay on the call and answer a few more questions for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Right, we are now going to move over to Anne Freeman. Anne is the Deputy Director, Deputy Fish and Reform at Defra. And Anne, can I welcome you? I don't know whether you want to just give a little introduction of your role, or if we'd like to just go into questions, but I leave that up to you. I'm going to mute myself so that you can let us know what your job entails, and then we'll launch into some questions.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Cheryl, for that introduction and for inviting me to speak. My team led the drafting and delivery of the Fisheries Act, and we are have been responsible for a number of the sort of day one Brexit projects to ensure that things were in place. And of course, now we've got the reform agenda and we'll be managing fisheries. I'm happy to move straight into questions, but I could also set out a bit of build on some of the remarks that the Secretary of State made in relation to perhaps the Fisheries Act and then some of our reform priorities, if you wanted to do that.
Shall we see how we get on with questions, and then perhaps you could do that at the end, if that's okay?
Yeah, very happy to do that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, the first question for you, Anne, comes from Simon MacDonald, who's chairman of the West Coast Regional Inshore Fisheries Group. So another one from Simon. And he says, when will the fishing industry be able to access the £100 million fund promised by the UK government?
So the short answer to that is soon. I'm sure you're all very fed up of government saying that sort of thing, but we are working through the details of the funding, and we'll provide more information. The money will be available from the next financial year, which is shortly upon us. But I mean, the Prime Minister has committed to providing that investment to rejuvenate the industry and coastal communities across the UK. It will support investment in the sector and ensure that we have the capacity and the capability needed to land, process and market more seafood. So watch this space, I think, is the short answer.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'll be watching it very closely, and don't be at all surprised if it doesn't keep popping up at Defra questions, and I apologise for the repetition now. Our next question comes from Gary Taylor, who is a fisheries consultant. And Gary asks, what measures is the government taking to ensure a viable future for the UK's distant water fishing fleet?
So good to hear via you from Gary, long time no hear. So I think we have signed framework agreements with Norway and the Faroe Islands, which provide annual bilateral negotiations for access to fishing opportunities in those countries' waters and the distant waters. And as I understand at the moment, as a result of particular agreements with Norway and the UK, between Norway and the UK, the 2 vessels in our distant waters fleet are currently fishing off Svalbard. So as for the other opportunities that I know that they are eager to exploit, that will be dependent on the outcome of the negotiations with Norway and the Faroes, which haven't concluded yet, but let's just put on record that it is not unprecedented for them not to have finished by this time of the year.
Thank you very much, Anne. And it seems as though nothing's changed with the UK, EU, Norway negotiations than to when it was just the EU and Norway. Our next question comes from June Mummery from BFP Eastern, and it gives you the opportunity to build on something that the Secretary of State picked up on. June asks, is the government considering the reinstatement of the 1988 Merchant Shipping Act to ensure that UK quota is owned by vessels that land in the UK rather than just carrying the UK flag?
So June and I have spoken about this a number of times. A very important issue. I think, as the Secretary of State alluded to, we have the government has chosen to implement this through looking at the licence conditions that we have that require vessels to prove an economic link with the UK. And many people will recall that we ran a consultation late last year looking at how we could strengthen that economic link licence condition. And as the Secretary of State said, we will be announcing the outcome of that and our plans for strengthening the economic link very soon. So that's sort of one strand of how we're doing it. So we fully intend for more fish to be landed in the UK to bring that through there. In terms of foreign ownership, that's more difficult. We don't want to discourage foreign investment in the UK. However, and we don't want to destabilise the fishing industry at the moment. It is going through a challenging time, and that's why, as the Secretary of State noted, we are keeping the allocation of existing quota the same, but we have consulted on how we will distribute the additional quota, and again, that the response to the consultations on both how we will do it at UK level and then how we will allocate that additional quota in England will be out shortly once the annual negotiations have concluded. So, we are looking at ways we can get greater benefit into the UK, and the government has decided to go down a slightly different route than reinstating the 1988 Merchant Shipping Act.
Thank you very much. And of course, the 1988 Act didn't stop foreign nationals from going onto the British Shipping Register, because there was just a commitment of a certain percentage of ownership had to be with the UK, and the bar was set very high. And it does sound as though the Secretary of State is setting the bar very much higher now with regard to the landing commitments. The next one comes from Dr. Clive Fox of the Scottish Association of Marine Science. And he asks, there is increasing scientific evidence and NGO pressure in favour of no-take zones, such as the highly protected marine areas. But the fishing industry are also facing large area exclusions due to the construction of offshore renewables. What is the best way to deal with the cumulative effects of these two different types of exclusion post-Brexit? Now, I know this is probably a question for environment under the Marine and Coastal Access Act with the marine planning, but you might be able to sort of expand on it a little bit.
Yes, thank you. And of course, the answers I'm giving are in relation to England. There will be devolution at work in some of these areas, including on this one. So bearing that in mind, I mean, I think everybody recognises that there are real spatial challenges for all marine users. We've also got to do more to improve the marine environment. I think one of the ways that we can get through this, because we are going to have to balance a range of issues in making these decisions, I think one of the best ways of doing that is by making sure that we are being very clear and we are communicating and we are bringing all the relevant parties together so that we fully understand the implications and impacts. And certainly I think there is appetite in Defra for us to be doing that, both in terms of the offshore wind, but also in relation to Richard Benyon's review of highly protected marine areas, where we need to pick that up again. And we're very grateful for the time that the fishing industry has made to discuss the review of that. But I think we should also, not forget some of the benefits that these bring. So, HPMAs and marine protected areas can have beneficial impacts on fish stocks, which ultimately will help the catching sector. Albeit, there are some disruptions into where they can fish. So I think it's about talking together, bringing the relevant parties together, and I think having that real evidence-based focus on proposals and considering and balancing the social and economic and environmental impact of all these activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Our next question comes from another fisherman, this time from Fraserburgh, Robert Souter. And he says, will fishing authorities be enforcing the 12-mile rule, which states that UK registered vessels with crew under transit visas cannot fish within 12 miles of the shore to aid the inshore fleet? There are reports that Border Force is not adequately enforcing the rules.
So, recognise that this is one of the big issues for the Scottish inshore fleet in particular, and others. I think enforcement of these rules is a matter for Border Force, so I can't comment on that, I'm afraid. But just to say that the fisheries authorities from around the UK do cooperate and they do share intelligence, but that really is a matter for Border Force.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Simon MacDonald again, Chair of the West Regional Inshore Fisheries Group, Scotland. It is understood, that the government has offered a 6-month period of grace to EU seafood imports to deal with new paperwork and so on. Why was this grace period not reciprocated for UK exporters?
So again, I'm afraid this is one I'll slightly have to duck, because that really is a matter for the EU rather than the UK. The UK government decided that we would phase in import controls to give business impacted by COVID-19 in particular a bit of time to adjust. But as to why the EU didn't reciprocate, I think that's a matter for them.
Thank you, Anne. And this one comes from Gary Taylor, who is a fisheries consultant. Has an estimate been made of the net benefits of Brexit quota increases when factors such as paperfish, loss of the Hague preference, loss of opportunities for example, Greenland's waters, loss of markets and cost of health certificates and other non-tariff barriers are taken into account?
So again, I think this is a slightly difficult and political question that as a civil servant I have to be careful about. But I think Bay's ministers confirmed in the House that there wasn't time to do that analysis, but did commit that impact assessments on any secondary legislation under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement would be made in the usual way.
Thank you very much. And last question, Anne, and then if you would perhaps like to take the opportunity to say anything else about the Fisheries Bill that you would like to. It comes from Sam James, who is a handline fisherman very close to my home in Cornwall. I know that my colleague Sherilyn McCrory will also take a great interest in this answer because she does have some in her constituency as well. And he asks, will the newly allocated UK quota for bluefin tuna be accessible to all vessels in relevant sea areas? Currently, the lack of quota means that this species and others in the same area are unable to be targeted despite there being a strong market.
There is huge interest in this, absolutely. We totally recognise that. So yeah, there is huge demand from it from both the commercial sector, the recreational fishing sector, the scientific community, and we also have to be very careful because we must give bluefin tuna sufficient protection given its sort of vulnerability. So we did secure a small share of quota in the Eastern Atlantic bluefin tuna stock under the TCA. The share still needs to be formalised between the EU and us and the International Commission of the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas. And that's a process that's very actively underway at the moment. So yes, we are looking at very carefully at how we can best use and make use of this valuable but very small quota. So again, another one I'm afraid where we will need to watch this space.
And thank you very much for answering those questions. And if I can now ask you to perhaps give us a little bit of an overview about the Fisheries Act and various things, and then I'll come back to close. But we do appreciate the time that you've given and the Secretary of State today. So over to you.
Thank you very much. So I suppose I should start this section by saying that at the outset that I fully recognise that the fishing and seafood industry is angry and it's hurting at the moment, and I think different parts in very different ways, and recognise too that Defra has got a big job to do to rebuild trust with the industry, and that's something that we are very keen to do. We recognise it will take time and it won't be easy, but I think it would be useful to put on record again our commitment to greater partnership working, and moving over time to co-management with industry, where they can help and own the decisions made. So I think that's just really important to put on the record. I will try not to repeat too much of what the Secretary of State has said, but just to build on a few bits. So, the Fisheries Act plays a really important role, both in terms of setting the framework for how we'll manage fisheries, but as the Secretary of State said, in enabling us to do so. And a lot of what follows will be familiar through the debates during the passage of the Act, but it's possibly just helpful to put it in context again. So the framework for how we will manage fisheries in future were the bits of the bill that attracted most debate, and really good and lively debate. I think, as the Secretary of State reminded us, we have the 8 fisheries objectives, which the policies of the 4 fisheries administrations will have to follow, deliver. And as many of you will have heard repeatedly, 6 out of the 8 of those objectives were environmentally focused. So to give a bit of an update, work has begun with the devolved administrations to start drafting the Joint Fisheries Statement, which was another aspect of the Act that attracted considerable attention. And this JFS will be legally binding and will set out how the administrations will deliver the objectives either jointly or individually. We have to publish the JFS by November 2022, which sounds a long way off, but it isn't, particularly when you consider the breadth of areas it'll have to cover, from our approach to negotiations to the technical conservation measures that we use to manage fisheries manage fisheries. We've also got to navigate through various elections. We have to do some formal consultation, and as there is an important role for Parliament to scrutinise it, we have to work through parliamentary recesses as well. So, like with lots of things, we are planning to develop the JFS openly, transparently, and with hopefully considerable constructive engagement with the fishing industry, ENGOs and civil society. So the final bit of our framework relates to the fisheries management plans, which will revolutionise how we manage our fisheries and enable us to manage our diverse fisheries more appropriately. And again, we have started to scope how we'll deliver those. It's going to be a long-term and pretty resource-intensive project, but we are planning to pilot a number of the shellfish management plans through some of the groups that we are working with already. So that's the sort of framework. The Act also confers the powers to allow us to implement our international obligations and move away from the common fisheries policy. And this is where we sort of loop back to the TCA, and in particular, the critical recognition it gives for the UK as a sovereign state to exercise regulatory autonomy. So provided the actions we take follow the principles in the TCA, the objectives in the Act, for example, we are using best available science, and that the actions don't discriminate against EU vessels, we have the freedom to develop our own policies and management regime now. And so that's very much something that we intend to do in England. And I think, as I alluded to in relation to the fisheries management plans, we want to take a much more nuanced approach, following an evidence-based and collaborative approach to adapt our fisheries management to be more site or fisheries specific. And I think it's for that reason we need to be a bit careful about how we respond to the various calls for us to use our newfound powers and immediately impose blanket bans on a whole range of things. Blanket bans are a bit of a blunt instrument, and I think fisheries management needs something a little bit more nuanced. But that's not to say that we're not looking at lots of ways we can reform fisheries. We are doing a lot in this area. So in England, since the end of the transition period, we've noted how we're reviewing our policy on super trawlers. We've stopped pulse trawling and launched a consultation on bylaws for marine protected areas. Defra has also got some unfinished business, as we've talked a little bit about, so the consultations on additional quota and economic link, and also we need to publish our the material we had in relation to our call for evidence on remote electronic monitoring. So there's a whole host of other things we need to do that's probably just useful to put on people's radars. So we've got some immediate work to implement the Trading Cooperation Agreement. So I think the Secretary of State mentioned how we need to work out how we can facilitate the swapping of quota between the UK and the EU, because there is a real industry appetite on both sides to see that progress quickly. We also need to put in place management of fishing for non-quota stocks in our waters by EU vessels, and the EU will need to do the same. Again, it's an area we need to progress quickly because of the value and vulnerability of the stocks, because of the importance to our industries. So then, moving on, discharging our new duties and responsibilities as an independent coastal state will be no mean feat either. Colleagues in Marine Scotland calculated that there are some 499 functions, duties and responsibilities that we've now all taken on, and so that's our new day job for all of the administrations. So sort of turning back more to England and looking into the longer term and back into the sort of reform space. We've now got the TCA and understand the framework it gives. We're also very mindful of the impacts of COVID on the industry. So we think it's right to take a little bit of time to work with industry and interested parties to consider what more work we should be doing. Have some of the activities set out in the Fisheries White Paper, for example, become more or less important and urgent. Some of the ideas on that list will be familiar, like looking at the landing obligation, reform of producer organisations, better shellfish management, and looking at specific issues relating to the inshore fleet. But are there new areas we need to look at, or different emphasis we need to give on some of that? So I am shutting up soon, promise. So I think all of that has deliberately focused on fisheries management, but I should just conclude by flagging that, you know, Defra fully recognises the importance of the whole supply chain in this space, and ensuring that, you know, the profitability and success of all of it. And I think Secretary of State touched on some of the activities underway to help exporters, and there's very much more we need to do in relation to that supply chain. Seafood 2040, for example, has got some areas on which we need to redouble our efforts. We need to think about boosting domestic consumption and creating new markets. And of course, the DAs will also no doubt be looking at their priorities. So lots going on in this space. And I think very, very finally, just to sum up, TCA, the Fisheries Act, give us all the framework we need to operate, but there's an awful lot in hand, but an awful lot more to do and to plan and to prioritise. And we are going to need plenty of help and engagement as we work through to create this kind of gold standard for fisheries management and a really truly sustainable and successful fishing and seafood sector. Thank you.
And thank you very, very much for that. I've learned some things from you today, so I'm sure that other people have as well. And I hope that this will be the first of many events this APPG can do to engage with the department so that we can work together. You mentioned promoting seafood to the domestic market. It's something that we are looking at as an all-party parliamentary group, and hopefully in the not too distant future, when we're all allowed to go out and socialise again and eat in restaurants, we will all eat a lot more fish. Can I say, I know that you are a very, very busy lady as well, because we politicians find it easy to say things, but we forget that there's a whole host of people behind the scenes that have to deliver on the decisions we take. And I'd just like you to take back to your staff our grateful thanks for all the work that they're doing. So thank you very much. And on that, again, I would just like to say a huge thank you to the Fishmongers Company, without whom these events wouldn't take place. I'm not sure how many we did reach up to, but when I looked at the numbers, it was going up well towards 300. So can I thank all of those participants, and also urge you, if there is any questions that you have submitted that you feel weren't answered today in the short time we've had, please contact the Secretariat, because I am sure that if we send them to the department, they would be more than happy to look at them and try to answer your questions. So on that, I don't know whether Jacob wants to unhide himself now. Jacob, I don't know whether you want to say anything before we close on the part of our Secretariat, Mindfully Wired. But if you haven't got anything, then I think we'll close down the meeting on time. But over to you, just in case you do.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Yes, just echoing what you said, really. Thank you so much to both our speakers for presenting and answering all those questions, and to all the attendees who came along. Yeah, I hope you'll agree this has been really interesting and insightful. And just to say, look out for the post-event materials that should be coming soon into your inbox and on our website. That will consist of the event recording, and we also hope to have a digest of the Q&A as well. But yeah, just to say, we'll be launching our next event too. So do sign up to our newsletter if you're not already. Keep an eye on social media and you'll be the first to know. So thank you very much. That's all for me, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you very much, everybody. So I declare this meeting of the APPG well and truly closed. Thank you very much to everybody who's joined.